I am ridiculously excited for Death Stranding 2 on the beach coming to PC. A lot of people argued it should have been like a Dark Horse Game of the Year candidate last year, and so awesome to see it coming to PC. And it's also being ported by Nixies, who generally does a better than typical job with work bringing console games to PC. But there's something especially interesting about this one, and that is that it's bringing an upscaling technology that we've never seen before on PC, and it's not developed by AMD, NVIDIA, or Intel. It's developed by Guerrilla Games for this engine. This is kind of interesting. If you dig into the notes here, we see that the PC edition of Death Stranding 2 launches with support for NVIDIA DLSS 4, AMD FSR 4, and Intel XeSS 2. Both upscaling and frame generation options are available for all technologies. But then get this, for the first time on PC, you'll find Pico as an option in upscaling settings. This progressive image compositor is developed by Guerrilla for the Decima engine and is the same upscaling technology that's used for Death Stranding 2 on PlayStation 5. Pico upscaling can be used with all supported graphics cards and can be combined with the various options for frame generation offered in the game. Now, this is super cool because honestly, Guerrilla's Decima engine is fantastic. And you get games like Horizon Forbidden West and, well, Death Stranding 2 that look so much better on consoles than most other games. And one of the things that looks so much better is the image quality, so that even when upscaling is used, it usually has a very good output. And one of the ways they've been doing that is by having their own upscaler design, which is now coming to PC for the first time. Now, I'm going to be honest, I think that if you have an NVIDIA GPU that supports DLSS 4, that's probably going to look better than Pico. But if you're somebody on an older AMD graphics card that doesn't support FSR 4, then I am very interested in finding out if this Pico upscaler is going to be better than older versions of FSR. Because from what we've seen on consoles, that does seem to be the case. Now, they're saying it can be used with all supported graphics cards, but as far as I can tell, they're not specifying which graphics cards support Pico, so I'm not sure if they need some level of, matrix acceleration and compute for doing, AI inferencing or anything like that. I didn't see any specification on what exact graphics cards would be supported for that. Also, they're mentioning that the upscaling, all of the various upscaling options can be used with dynamic resolution scaling or by setting your upscaling quality setting. Now, the reason why that's actually really useful is a lot of PC games don't support dynamic resolution scaling. This is generally the way consoles work, where you set a frame rate target, and then some areas in a game are going to be more demanding than others. So on PC, where you usually set a either native resolution or you set upscaling at quality, balance, performance, where the frame rate varies, but the image quality stays the same. On consoles, they usually set the frame rate they want to hit, and then in more demanding scenes, the upscaling gets more aggressive, and in less demanding scenes, you're closer to a native rendering resolution. I love when games actually support this on PC and it works well, because oftentimes I'm much happier if I set a constant frame rate. And like I said, it can just hit the frame rate that I'm happy with, and some scenes might have a little more upscaling applied than others. Now, one thing I'm noticing when we actually jump into these system requirements, which we have here, is that they are not specifically mentioning the use of upscaling. However, this is being done by Nixies, and I will say that in previous Nixies games, if you actually test out the hardware that they're recommending for certain performance targets, you really hit those performance targets through the use of dynamic resolution scaling. So when it's saying like 1440p 60 FPS at high settings on a 3070 or an RX 6800, I've seen other Nixies games where that's what they said in the system requirements, but really that's if you hit the dynamic resolution target to 60, but it doesn't usually need to get very aggressive. Like easier scenes, it can do it at native, but you would dip under under 60 FPS at native resolution at times, if you don't enable the dynamic resolution scaling with the 60 target. So there could be more demanding areas of the game that drop into the 50s or even the upper 40s, but the dynamic res scaling, can keep you at 60. So when I'm interpreting these system requirements lists, keep that in mind, that I think, just based on Nixie's previous work, that these are probably, if you'd never want to drop below this target, because again, they're saying it's an average performance, you would need some amount of dynamic scaling to keep it there when I'm interpreting this. Now, that being said, given how good Death Stranding 2 looks, it does seem like this is going to be another very optimized performance for Decima Engine. Again, Decima Engine was used in the first Death Stranding, which had very good performance for the visuals that you were getting. Although today, the visuals are a little outdated. Death Stranding 2 pushes those visuals a lot further, but does a good job on console. Looks like that seems to be the case on PC as well. Again, Decima Engine also used on games like Horizon Forbidden West, which I think is one of the best visual to performance ratios we've gotten, because the game looks great and doesn't take insane hardware in order to do so. Certainly a lot better visual to performance ratio than I think we get with things like Unreal Engine 5 in a typical game. Now, what kind of hardware do you need? Well, again, I love the system requirements chart because it is telling us the graphics settings and the average performance to expect on the hardware. Now, some quick things out of the way first. RAM, 16 gigabytes across the board, so it does not seem like you'll need 32 gigabytes of system memory for even the max settings at 4K, which is good news considering how expensive RAM is right now, although I think most people with like a 9070 XT build probably have 32 gigabytes of system RAM, but if you're building today, maybe you're skimping a little bit on the RAM. Also, they're saying 150 gigabyte SSD. They're not mentioning hard drive anywhere. Now, usually games that require an SSD can still run on a hard disk drive, but they're really saying it's unsupported. You might have problems. So I'm sure you could boot the game on a hard drive, but who knows if things will like load in late, causing things to pop in when they shouldn't, or if sometimes you get stuttery things not loading in when you would want them to. Now, if you just want to barely play the game at lowest settings, 30 FPS, that's probably, like I said, still relying on some dynamic resolution scaling to hold you there. You're only needing a GTX 1660 or an RX 5500 XT, although notice that they're saying the 5500 XT 8GB version. This was a card that had a 4GB version and an 8GB version, and they are explicitly stating that 4GB GPUs are not enough here. The GTX 1660 was a 6GB GPU, so I do think we can read this as saying you don't actually need 8GB for the lowest settings at 1080p 30, but you probably need at least 6, or they're at least saying that 4 is not enough. Could you get by with 5? I don't know. But the 1660 has 6, and they're saying the 5500 XT 4GB is not enough. That's how I would read that. Now, as far as scaling from here, I'll link all my sources in the video description. This is the Tech Power Up Relative Performance chart. And the relative performance chart here, you can click on any GPU to set it as the 100% baseline, and you can scroll and check other GPUs. So if your GPU is not listed, that's how you can compare. Now, the 1660, if I set that as the baseline, notice the 5500 XT is generally a bit weaker than that, but reaches 88% of its performance. And again, this isn't saying that performance in this specific game. This is just kind of general ballpark figures on average, but it's helpful. So these are, within a similar performance tier, even if they're not exactly identical. And you'd also be in a similar performance tier if you had a card like a 6500 XT. Again, watch the VRAM, 1650 Super, GTX 980, R9 Fury, RX 590, RTX 3050 8GB is also pretty close here in performance, 980 Ti, 1660 Ti, 1660 Super, 1070. Those are all kind of in the ballpark of these minimum 1080p low 30 kinds of GPUs. Now, for the CPU side of things, most graphic settings don't have a huge CPU impact, but the overall frame rate can only go so fast on certain CPUs. They're saying a Core i3 10100 or a Ryzen 3 3100 should at least get you 30 FPS in this game at low settings. Those aren't asking for a lot. A Ryzen 3 3100 is a 4-core processor with 8 threads that released way back in April of 2020 as a low-budget $99 CPU at the time. So this is 6 years old. old low-end 4-core CPU, from 6 years ago. That's all they're asking to get in the door with 30 FPS. Core i3-10100 is also listed. That's another 4-core 8-thread processor from April of 2020. So that's all they're asking to get 30 FPS. Now, if you want to go above that, they are asking for a little bit more. If you want to jump up to medium settings at 60 FPS 1080p output, again, I would imagine with some dips, unless you use some dynamic res scaling based on other Nixie's work on their system requirements, you want an RTX 3060 12GB or an RX 6600. So let's go ahead and pop back to this relative performance chart because you might not have one of those GPUs. So let's start at that baseline 1660 and scroll up and see how much more they're asking for, and maybe you'll spot your GPU along the way. So again, 1660 Super was for 1080p 30 low. Now, cards like the 1070 are more powerful than that by a little bit, right? 1070 Ti, 2080. 2060 is getting a lot more powerful here at this point. Now we run into the RX 6600, which interestingly is about 47% more powerful. But they're saying that we're going to jump from 1080p 30 at low settings to 1080p 60 at medium settings. Theoretically, you would need more than 2 times the performance to do that. So that actually tells me that either they're relying on more resolution scaling for this medium result than they were on the minimum result, or maybe the minimum will actually be averaging better than 30 FPS, because oftentimes they give you a ballpark figure here. This is not like benchmarks where they're giving you an exact figure. So I might interpret this as your 1080p 30 low might have actually been averaging more like in the mid 40s, but you're just not locking to 60. And then by getting not a full doubling in performance, you could hold closer to a 60 average, especially with some dynamic resolution scaling, by jumping up to cards like the RX 6600 and the 3060 12GB. That's how I would interpret specs like that. Because like I said, it's only about a 50% performance jump to get up to the RX 6600, and about a 66% performance jump to get up to the RTX 3060. Now, if I set the RX 6600 as the baseline, this being a mid-range to lower mid-range option that came out in 2021, this is fairly close in performance to the 3060 12GB, although the 3060 is generally faster, about 13% faster. A closer match typically from AMD would be a 6600 XT, but we're kind of splitting hairs here, especially if we interpret these not as benchmark results, but just kind of ballpark results, right? So that's how I'd interpret that. The CPUs are now jumping up to a Ryzen 5 5600 or an i5 11400 to, again, guarantee you closer to 60 FPS. They're not saying that these lower-end i3s and Ryzen 3s could guarantee a 60 FPS experience. So for a 60 FPS experience on the CPU, they're saying like a 6-core 12-thread CPU from the Ryzen 5 5600 generation should get you there. So mid-range CPU from about 4 years ago. These launched at about $199. That's kind of what they're talking about. The 11400 from Intel is also a 6-core 12-thread and launched in 2021. So again, a mid-range CPU from about 5 years ago seems to be what you need for about 60 FPS here. Now, if you're jumping up to 1440p 60 at high settings, they're now asking for a 3070 or a 6800. So that is a decent jump in GPU power here. Let's jump back into the relative performance chart. Maybe you'll spot your GPU along the way, again, if you're not one of the ones listed. So an RX 6600, a similar ballpark to like a 2070, 3060, even a 1080 Ti is a little bit more powerful. Then you get cards like a 2080 or RTX 5050. That's more powerful than the 1080p 60 FPS medium recommendations. We keep jumping up through more GPUs, cards like the 6700 XT, 3060 Ti. We're going for even more here. Now we're getting up to the 3070. That's about a 67% performance boost. And that's because you're jumping from 1080p to 1440p, but still trying to hold the same frame rate, and you're increasing graphic settings from medium to high. I've noticed in a lot of Nixie's games, the high settings are fairly close to what you get on PlayStation 5. Now, this is asking for more GPU power than what we get from a PlayStation 5, but the PlayStation 5 might be rendering at a lower rendering resolution, and then, relying on more upscaling. So that's something to think about. Also, oftentimes console games can be more targeted to the specific hardware and have a little bit more optimization on that front. But 1440p 60, RTX 3070 or RX 6800, this seems fairly reasonable for the jump in performance. They're asking to go up to 1440p. And remember, you could use more aggressive upscaling if you tried to hit that resolution target on a less powerful GPU. Now, if we look at the 3070 and compare it to the 6800 from AMD, these are fairly similar in performance. The 6800 generally is a little bit better at non-ray trace performance, but only a little bit, unless you spill over 8 gigabytes of VRAM, in which case the 6800 has 16, and you have an advantage there. However, NVIDIA has the better upscaler, so the RX 6800, this is where I'm going to be really interested on cards like this, how the that new Pico upscaler fares from an image quality perspective. Like, I doubt it'll match FSR4 or DLSS4, but could it beat the older versions of FSR? That's going to be pretty interesting to find out. Now, the CPUs are taking a leap again, but we're staying within the same generation, 5600 to 5700X, 11400 to 11700. So you're basically getting a little bit more clock speed and a couple more cores, but you're staying around the same kind of generation. So we're jumping to 8-core, 16-thread CPUs, but from that same kind of 2022 or 2021 era of CPU. Honestly, also, like I said, graphic settings and resolution don't have a huge impact on CPU. So if you're getting 60-ish FPS on the 5600, you should probably be okay even as you bump up resolution and graphic settings. It's really for more frame rate that you would want a more powerful CPU. But maybe these get a little more dips in the averages and these will be more consistent. Who knows? Last thing we got is the very high settings, which are targeting 4K 60. Again, very high. I think is usually in Nixie's games the highest graphics preset. So this would be max settings at 4K 60 FPS. But remember, it wouldn't surprise me if some resolution scaling was being used to hit this. They're saying an RTX 4080 or an RX 9070 XT, and the CPUs do not jump again. They're still saying you could stay at 16 gigabytes of system RAM. So last thing to really look at is, so what does that GPU jump look like, and what other GPUs would be in that ballpark? So if we keep the 3070 as the baseline, so for your 1440p 60 at high settings, but now we're looking to increase the frame rate and or graphic settings and or resolution, right? We're scrolling up. So cards like the 9060 XT, those are closer to the high rather than the very high stuff that we're seeing here. Cards like the 5060 Ti, the 6800 XT, 7800 XT, even the 3080 is still noticeably more powerful than those high setting stuff. But now we're again trying to climb up to that 4K 60. And eventually we get here to the 9070 XT. We're looking at a 78% performance bump, which sounds reasonable for going from 1440p to 4K, as well as increasing another notch in the graphics settings. So yeah, that seems like a reasonable bump, again, considering that there's also probably some resolution scaling happening here as well. Now, is the 9070 XT a pretty close match for the 4080? And the answer is yes. Generally, Tech Power Up has them within 6% of each other. So that is generally a pretty close matchup between the two. And the bigger differences will be in upscaling performance, the type of upscaling available, that kind of thing. So that's what we're seeing here. I think this is a good system requirement chart. I'm very interested in what that Pico upscaling ends up getting us. They are confirming ultra-wide support, which not every game has, so that's good to see. Looks like there's some Porter suit available stuff for pre-order bonuses, it looks like. Anyway, this all looks great. I'm excited for the game. Let me know what you guys think, and I hope all of you have an excellent day.